Okay, it's broadcasting.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining today's webinar. We will be starting soon. We're just waiting for everyone to start logging on. If you can hear us, let us know, but give us a few minutes as we wait for people to log on. Hey everyone, so I will let Kendra start this, or Kendra, you can feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hi, everybody. We're still waiting for people to log on, but we can get started. So thank you for coming to today's webinar. My name is Kendra Van Water. I work at Anti-Violence Partnership of Philadelphia, and I'm the director of an initiative that focuses on finding more survivor-centered services and improving how we respond to homicides when it comes to what we like to call complex homicides. So we focus on family members who murder other family members and domestic violence murders. So these webinars are through a partnership and federal funding that we have with the National Center for Victims of Crime, who is hosting this webinar and sponsoring this webinar. So thank you all for coming, and we're gonna get started, and I'm going to start by introducing Dr. Tanya Sharpe. And I'm just going to read her bio. Give me 1 second because my screen is not working. And actually, before I introduce her, we're gonna go through a couple of housekeeping items. So please, everyone, keep your screen on mute so that we can limit the background noise. If you have questions, we will have a Q&A at the end of the webinar. You can always type your questions in the chat, and then I can read the questions during the Q&A, and we'll go over the answers. If you have anything during any time, you can type it in the chat. There's going to be a few slides where they're interactive, and we'll ask you all to have some answers about some things. So please feel free to jump in when asked about certain, opinions, questions, and also feel free, you don't have to talk, it's okay. So you can type things in the chat, and then we can get started. I'll introduce Dr. Sharpe, and I'll read her bio. Tanya Sharpe joined the Factor in MCAASHV faculty in July 2018 after serving as an associate professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore School of Social Work for 11 years. Dr. Sharpe is the founder and director of the Center for Research and Innovation for Black Survivors of Homicide Victims, also known as the CRIB. The CRIB is an interdisciplinary, community-based social work research center dedicated to reducing service inequities for Black survivors of homicide victims by advancing collaborative, culturally responsive research, restorative policy, and evidence-based practice. Dr. Sharpe has developed culturally appropriate interventions and best practices designed to assist African American survivors of homicide victims in the management of their grief and bereavement. Her comprehensive model of coping for African American survivors of homicide victims has informed the development of a psychosocial educational intervention and a tool of measurement designed to assess the needs and coping strategies of African American survivors of homicide victims. Through interdisciplinary collaborations, Dr. Sharpe is currently utilizing her track record of diverse community engagement to expand upon her seminal research findings by advancing our understanding and delivery of services to African, Caribbean, and Black survivors of homicide victims throughout our global community. Dr. Sharpe's expertise also includes mass violence and disaster research, qualitative research methods, suicide prevention and education research, and community organizing and program development. Dr. Sharpe currently holds the Endowed Chair in Social Work in the Global Community at the Factor in MCAASHV Faculty of Social Work and is the recipient of the 2018 Distinguished Alumni Award from her alma mater, Boston College Graduate School of Social Work. During that year, she received the inaugural Spotlight Award from the University of Maryland's Organization of African American Students in Social Work and is the recipient of the National Association of Social Workers, Maryland Chapter's 2016 Social Work Educator of the Year, and Dr. Martin Luther King Diversity Recognition Award for Outstanding University of Maryland, Baltimore faculty. The Dr. Martin Luther King Special Recognition Award for co-developing a course entitled Freddie Gray Baltimore, Past, Present, and Moving Forward, and she's also the recipient of the 2014 Governor of Maryland's Victim Assistance Award. So now that I've introduced Dr. Sharpe, we get started, and here we go. Feel free, we have breaks built in also, so feel free to mute, go to the bathroom, and do what you need to do, and we'll be here when you get back.
Kendra, thank you so much for that introduction. I want to be cognizant of someone in the chat who basically said that they couldn't hear anything. And I just want to take a moment before we get started to make sure everyone can hear and see things clearly. So if someone can give me a thumbs up and okay, something like that in the chat, that would be great before we begin. And I'll keep talking to make sure that's okay. But if someone on the team could give me an okay, working great, all good. Oh, love it, love. See, this is what I love, by the way. I digress for a moment, but I love doing presentations in front of people where we can get all the feels. And so this webinar, we're gonna try to make that happen. We're gonna try to ignore the fact that we're all social distancing due to COVID-19 and still remain in contact and in community with one another. So thank you so very much. And you can see perfectly. That is fantastic. So thank you all for joining this morning. And again, Kendra, thank you so much for the introduction. What Kendra didn't say is Kendra and I go way back. I have the honor and privilege of teaching Kendra in one of my community organization classes at the University of Maryland School of Social Work. And she was a stellar student that stood out, in particular because of her passion and commitment to community engagement, to uplifting the voices of so many who are so vulnerable. So it's an honor to work with her today. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is just begin by going through the agenda. Next slide. So our agenda today is really going to start with talking about the root. When we think about the title of this webinar, Strange Fruit, the Sociocultural Embodiment of Homicide Violence, I want us to start by understanding the root. and I'll explain that in a moment. Then we're going to take a 10-minute break. One of the things that I recognize when I do this work, when I give seminars and trainings, or even interview, lucky enough to sit and share space with survivors of homicide victims, is a lot of what we're talking about is heavy stuff. Many of you are clinicians, teachers, police officers, service responders from all walks of life who come in contact with survivors of homicide victims. And we need to begin to be intentional about how we interact with survivors of homicide victims, but also reflect and understand how their stories of survivorship impact us. So to that end, I have built in several breaks for us to just take a deep breath, walk around, take a bio break, phone a friend, whatever you need to do as we journey through this webinar. The next section of the webinar will focus on homicide violence and victimization. We'll take a deeper dive into understanding the complexity of homicide violence and the victims that it leaves in its wake. Then we'll take another break and really take another deeper dive specifically into examining the coping strategies, better understanding the coping strategies of African-American survivors of homicide victims. We'll take a break after that and discuss implications for research, policy, and practice, and then take some questions from you, the audience. So without further ado, next slide, let's begin. So when we think about the tree, when we think about strange fruit, we begin to understand the root causes and consequences of homicide violence and victimization. Actually, let me start by giving you a verse. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. In 1939, Billie Holiday recorded that iconic song written by Abel Maripol that would tell the vivid tale about the racist lynching of Black bodies. And 81 years later, the brutal realities of that song still hold true today. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. I want to focus for a moment on that one line, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. I want to focus on the root. In preparation for this webinar today, I thought it was important. No, actually it's imperative. It's imperative that we have a shared language, a shared understanding, if you will, relevant to the root causes of homicide violence in our country, with a keen focus on the disproportionate impact of homicide violence in the African American community. There are several interpretations to the song Strange Fruit. Some even deeming it the first great protest song, wherein a Black woman dared to tell the truth about the brutal killing of Black bodies. But the gem that is often overlooked here is the calling out, the telling, if you will, shedding light on the systemic structures of inequity and injustice at the root of the tree that serves as the foundation for bearing strange fruit. Understanding that verse in this way, understanding the importance of shared language, understanding the root, helps us to kind of see and capture that the very fabric of our society is an embodiment of this reality. Understanding homicide, violence, and victimization in this way allows us to understand that the root causes, consequences, and solutions are rooted in understanding the foundation that feeds them, that feeds homicide violence. And it helps to amplify and understand how we might begin to create culturally responsive approaches to prevent homicide violence and intervene. Let's go further. Next slide. Next slide. I want you to, for a moment, let's say a minute. I want you all to take a minute to jot down in 5 words or less what you are seeing. Just your reactions, your initial thoughts, 5 words or less, what you're seeing here. And Kendra, while we're waiting for folks to gather their thoughts, what I'd like you to do, after you all have had a chance to jot them down, just drop them in the chat. And what I'm gonna ask Kendra to do is actually just read off some of the reflections regarding what we're seeing. Give you guys a few more seconds. I see some good stuff, people. Talk to me. We can do this. We can have a collective community, even though we are social distancing. Talk to me. Love it, love it, love it.
So we have people writing, they see Jim Crow, beautiful Black strength in the face of adversity, voter suppression, hope, the desire to get ahead, family, father at the head, dignity and pride and resilience, generations, how patient and humble we are, family, business, bus, church, community, hope, quiet rebellion, generations, patience, Black faith, Black strength, standing up straight with dignity, united together even through inequality, Black people standing up strong for their rights, faith, and waiting.
Okay, thank you. Let's take a look at another slide. Next slide. And again, let's take about a minute or so, in 5 words or less. Can you jot down what you're seeing here? Okay, Kendra, can you read for the audience?
Yes, so we have mass incarceration in the land of the free, enslavement, freedom for whom, systemic oppression. The U.S. was built on slavery, institutionalized oppression, our country thriving on the enslavement of Black people, bondage, setup, contradiction, a country built on oppression, pain, destruction, bondage, and separation, America built on Black bodies, bondage, slavery as the foundation of the country, systemic racism, country built on oppression, America enslaving man with chains, chains of oppression, continued state-sanctioned systemic oppression, many links of oppression, no chances, pain of institutionalized racism, Black men in chains, oppression from a system purposely designed that way, the shackles still remain, and hopelessness.
Thank you, Kendra, and thank you, everyone. Next slide. Again, in 5 words or less, just jot down what you're seeing and even maybe what you're feeling, what your thoughts are, initial thoughts about this picture here. Okay, Kendra, could you?
Yep. We have resiliency, purpose, hope, pride, and strength, fighting the same fight for generations, long lines for employment, allyship, exploitation, opportunity awaits, always waiting, hopeful, still waiting for change to come, not much has changed, waiting for hope, perseverance of Black people, the same line as 1965, history repeats itself, I feel he looks hopeful yet tired, dedication, feeling discouraged because there's hope in his eyes but not going to happen, and the man that stands out already has a certain look of defeat.
Thank you, Kendra. Next slide. And again, 5 words or less, jot down in the chat what you believe you're seeing, what you're feeling, your initial reactions here.
So far, we have lack of funding for schools, a chance to learn, more inequity regarding education, poverty, community myself in as a child in North Carolina, Black joy in education with no support, segregation, poverty, future to come, innocence paying the price. The children seem happy and don't seem to understand they're living in poverty. What will their future be? Separate but equal is not equal, and poverty and segregation.
Thank you, Kendra. And this next slide. Again, in 5 words or less, jot down your initial reactions and what you're seeing here.
So far, we've got sadness and anger about injustice, Black people being invisible and killed as usual, power beyond the grave, community in grief, trauma repeating itself, victims of hate and ignorance, anger and sadness, the present blood on the leaves, injustice, anger, lives gone too soon and no opportunity for them, anger, racial terror, enraged, furious, and horrified, a movement of change from tragedy. Who might they have been? Innocent blood being shed, and unaccomplished visions due to injustice.
Thank you so much, Kendra, and thank you, audience, for participating with me as we kind of shepherd this webinar together. The words that you shared are invaluable. Invaluable to helping us understand the steady entanglement, the steady tentacles that lay at the root of the tree that result in inequity when we see in voter suppression, inequity when we're talking about mass incarceration and the disproportionate representation of Black and brown individuals in our jails. When we talk about police brutality and the disproportionate representation of Black trans women, Black men, Black women in terms of police brutality, when we think about it in terms of unequal access to employment opportunities. Someone mentioned the idea of always waiting, being patient and always waiting. The whole idea of having educational systems that we know. I used to teach in the Hartford Public School System in Connecticut, and students in the 1990s were working with textbooks that were missing chapters, dilapidated school buildings that had lead, and we know that disproportionately, again, Black and Latinos in particular in the US, are sitting in those classrooms attempting to learn, right? The foundation of young bodies is within that structure. And then the last slide, when we think about, again, the horrible continued murders, and let's be clear, the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor are not new. They're not new occurrences. These are things that have been continuing over and over again. But what does it do? What does it do to a people, to our society, if over and over again these things are repeated? These structural inequities, and we've named a few, we could go on, but these structural inequities that you have been able to easily name and identify are at the root of the tree. And these structural inequities are inherently violent. Next slide. The World Health Organization defines violence as the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, or psychological harm. Let's just take a minute to absorb that. Ladies and gentlemen, the structural inequities that we have just discussed are inherently violent based upon that definition, right? Systemically feeding the root of the tree and contributing to homicide, violence, and victimization. Next slide. Structural inequities, one would suggest, are harmful in their very nature, but they're insidious because they seem so ordinary sometimes, right? Or people will explain it away. Maybe it's because the person didn't try hard enough, right? Or we can somehow, if we're not looking at the root, right? If we're not looking at the root and all of the intersectionality of it, sometimes we can simply explain it away as something ordinary or just an outlier, right? In our way of understanding the world, to the point where they almost appear invisible. I've been thinking a lot and ruminating about this, how might we be able to shape the paradigm? So we begin to make the invisible visible. And I think that unpacking the root of the tree really gets us there. Next slide. I thought about this a lot, thinking about it a lot lately. And in particular, if you'll bear with me for a moment, I want to move for a moment from the focus of the embodiment of structural violence and its impact on our systems that we've just talked about, to how the toxicity, the blood at the root of the tree has lasting consequences for some of our most vulnerable. In a recent interview with a young Black man, he referred to himself as Smiley. He's a young Black man in his teens from Baltimore, Maryland. And I was doing a series of focus groups for the purpose of evaluating a project designed to support young men of color who had experienced violence and victimization. And I thought about when Smiley began to share his story with me. He is a survivor of homicide and victimization. Not once, not twice, but 3 times over. Something that I know folks in Philadelphia are all too familiar with. But I began to think about all of the structures, the systems in Smiley's life that he'd come in contact with. And he began to talk to me about how his father was incarcerated, how he witnessed the murder of his friend while they were walking to a local corner store. And he distinctly described the visuals that he saw. He talked about how he felt as though he wouldn't see past his 21st birthday. And so going to school when the teachers often didn't pay attention or didn't ask him how his day was or acknowledge the atrocities that he'd experienced, and that's why he wasn't basically paying attention in school. I thought about all of those systems of inequity that penetrated his life. And I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you've ever experienced someone and you've looked at them and their eyes are almost vacant. It's as if they've lost a part of their soul about their humanity. And I've been doing this work for over 2 decades now. And I'm constantly coming in contact with that same vacant stare. And when I think about the structures of inequity and the structural violence that Smiley and so many others come in contact with, what do we expect? How is it possible that we expect that there is not going to be strange fruit coming from that tree? It doesn't mean we give up hope. It doesn't mean that it's not possible to do the things that we can do to prevent and intervene. But it does set some social cultural context that we can no longer just begin engaging with just the individual, just the family. We have to look at structural and interpersonal change in that way. When he asked me why I was there, I responded and said, because I don't want to see another person that looks like you have to go through what you've gone through. And in that moment, I saw a glimmer, just a glimmer of hope. I'm very clear when we do this work is about seeing, being, and then doing. We often are a reactive society. We see something and we want to get to doing. We are in a time, ladies and gentlemen, where we've got to start being in the work, seeing it, yes. Many people are seeing for the first time the atrocities that have been done to black and brown bodies. But now we have to be in that space of discomfort, amplify, being in terms of amplifying our voices to do better. I digress though. Next slide. So again, thinking about Smiley, it reminded me not only of the tree and the importance of rooting it, if you will, in healthy soil, right? That would allow it to bear beautiful fruit. But it also reminded me of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this really begins to cement the construct of structural violence, of the root and understanding it. If we think about the structural violences and homicide in this way, at the base, we have the physiological needs, basic needs, food, water, warmth, and rest. If someone is unemployed and doesn't have equitable access to housing, and you'll also see further, if someone doesn't have access to, if someone living in a food desert and doesn't have access or transportation to basic needs, if the school is providing the only meal that a child will have, if indigenous populations don't have access to clean drinking water, at the basic level, they're experiencing violence before we even get to homicide. If we look at safety, there is a tenuous, let's say, relationship between Black communities and the police, for example. If police are designed to protect and serve, but I know that disproportionately, I'm seeing it not only in my community, I'm experiencing it directly, and if I'm not, I need only turn on Twitter, Facebook, so forth and so on, and I'm seeing this over and over again. I begin to question who has my best interests at heart. Where am I safe? If I know that community violence is occurring disproportionately in my neighborhood, and that I put my life at risk when I leave my home and walk to school, my safety needs are put at risk, right? Which is inherently violent. Belongingness and love and need, intimate relationships and friends. Well, if we know disproportionately that young Black and Latino men are incarcerated, they are absent from the home. There's a disconnect in the relationship, right? And so again, this is just one example. I could give many, but that connectedness is severed, right? And so that requires repair, okay? And so intimate relationships become those that you make. Esteem and needs, prestige and feeling of accomplishment. Well, if I'm told that I might not, or I told basically not directly but indirectly by what I'm seeing, that I might not make it to my 21st birthday, what do I have to lose? What do I have to lose? Self-actualization, again, achieving one's full potential, including creative activities. Again, if I'm seeing these messages of the annihilation of my people, right? There's a message there that the system, as it's created, doesn't care about people that look like me. That does something to someone. I haven't even gotten to actual homicide, violence, and victimization. The case that I'm trying to make here is that systemic roots built on social injustice and racism permeate the fabric of our society in such a way that individuals are experiencing repeated forms of trauma and violence and victimization. This historical and current and social cultural perspective needs to be understood in order for us, before we even begin, this shared language, this collective way of understanding needs to be understood before we even begin to talk about surviving the homicide of a loved one. Next slide. 100,000 African Americans will die every year simply because they are Black. Not even at the homicide slides, ladies and gentlemen, just by being. And we really saw, COVID-19 really sort of amplified this reality for us. Next slide. When we think about pre-existing health conditions, when we started to sort of capture the data by race relevant to those individuals who tested positive for COVID-19 and those individuals that unfortunately died as a result of it, we began to see patterns of inequity. And some of that inequity was surprising to some, but it really isn't when we think about the pre-existing health conditions that exist for, again, disproportionately Black and brown people. Heart disease, 46.5% of Americans with heart disease are Black. Diabetes, African Americans are at 77% higher risk of developing diabetes than white Americans. HIV, African Americans represent 43% of new HIV diagnoses in 2018, but comprise only 12% of the US population. Next slide. I wanna take a moment to drive the point home, if you will, by even looking at access to healthy foods in the United States. And I want you to take a look at this map, if you will. Megan, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate that. Megan is one of the research assistants at the crib, and she's doing a wonderful job. Can everyone see that screen clearly? It's a little small for me, but I don't know. Can you guys talk to me? Talk to me. I want to make sure you can see. Yes, everything's good.
It looks good to me. If you guys are having trouble seeing it, you can shift your screen and make the presenter names and photos where you see Dr. Sharpe a little bit smaller, and that will in turn make the PowerPoint larger.
Thank you so much. All right. So everybody, it looks like everybody can see that. So thank you so much. So Megan, if you can hone in on Philadelphia for a moment. And again, thinking about this slide really sort of amplifies and gets us to understand a visual depiction of access to healthy foods, so forth and so on in Philadelphia specifically. When we look at sort of the low income and then low access layers, in other words, individuals who have low SES, socioeconomic status, and how close they are to, let's say, a local Whole Foods or a fruit stand, so forth and so on. This map really depicts that access. So Megan, if you could check off that first one. Yeah, so folks can see it. So here we're looking at low income, and then access to healthy food grocery stores within a 10-mile radius. And so you see there's some sort of disparate access. Then when we click off again, the next one, we talk about within a 10-mile radius or more, right? And then we see within 20 miles, right? And then I want folks, because we have a lot of Philly folks on the line, I want us to hone a little bit in on the city so that they can see the streets. Thank you so much, Megan. So we can begin to see sort of patterns of inequity, right? We can begin to see when we think about sort of the correlation between being able to act where the food is and being able to access it, that there's a disproportionate reality here. Okay? Thank you, Megan. Next slide. So what this really begins to, oh, sorry, I'll give you a second. Take your time, it's all right. Awesome. So what this really begins to amplify for us is yet another layer of structural inequity, right? So I want to break down these figures. I want to break down, on the left, we have figure 2. And when you observe the added sugar graph, top left, you can see that there's a relationship between lower income families and increased purchases in added sugar. Whereas the whole grain graph, top right, is associated with higher incomes. In other words, lower income families tend to buy more groceries with added sugar, and higher income families tend to buy more whole grains. But it's not a blame game. They're buying it because that's an issue of accessibility. So systemically, what are we saying? When now we have wonderful fruit stands and farmers markets that people can have access to. But this data is still telling us that when we are thinking about grocery stores and structures where people might go to shop, that we still have an incredible amount of inequity in terms of what individuals with low income can actually afford in terms of healthy foods. And when we think about the disproportionate representation of diabetes, of heart disease, there's a direct correlation there. Again, systemic structures, right? When we take a look at, I lost my place. The same is true if we look at the bottom 2 graphs. The more household income there is, the more produce you buy, and consequently, the better your health income or your health is. But again, what is important to acknowledge here is where healthy food options are. On the right 2 graphs, there are more grocery/superstores in neighborhoods with higher income than lower, and vice versa. There are more drugstores, convenience stores in lower income neighborhoods, right? In figure 3, presents the relationship between zip code median income and the healthy food options offered in grocery stores. Again, measured by added sugar content, added salt content. Figure 3 also shows that lower income neighborhoods tend to have fewer supermarkets and more drug and convenience stores that provide high sugar and salt content food options. And of course, the medication you need to take to manage the symptoms you acquire after consuming these foods. I'm drawing this out with clear points so that we can begin to understand the systemic nature of the blood at the root. Next slide. When we think about, as I mentioned, structural violence in COVID-19, the CDC found that 33% of people who've been hospitalized with COVID-19 are African American. Yet only 13% of the US population is African American. Some local communities have found a similar pattern in their data. Among the many 26 states reporting racial data on COVID-19, Blacks again account for 30% of COVID deaths. So if we look at this, just Milwaukee, for example, African Americans make up 70% of deaths, but make up 26% of the country's population. On the right, African Americans make up 11% of deaths, while comprising only 6% of the community in California. African Americans make up 50% of positive tests, while comprising only 33.3% of the community. And We know that Philly is just starting to sort of collect data by race and begin to tell a story, but it's not any different from other cities throughout our country, right? African Americans in Philly make up 39% of the 78 deaths resulting from COVID-19, while whites represent 29% of the COVID-19 deaths in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Structural violence is at the heart of the impact of so many structural inequities on some of our most vulnerable. And we particularly see this amplified during this pandemic. But it has, in fact, been at the heart of every pandemic and genocide we've seen. We've seen it in Hurricane Katrina. We saw it in Baltimore uprising. We see it over and over again. At some point, and I hope that we're there, we have got to begin to do some truth telling about the root in order to make some informed, concrete systemic changes. Next slide. So when we think about some of the images that we've seen, when we think about some of those, we saw voting suppression. We saw the disproportionate impact of unemployment in Black communities. We saw issues of police brutality. And this is another question I want to pose to the audience. When we think about this, and we think about voting, if we have structural inequity, if we have structural violence happening at the root, what happens to the political voice, right? Whether it's interpreted or actualized, what happens to the political voice of Black people? If we know that this unemployment, or even when you get a job, you're treated, you have an inequitable salary. There are economic mobilization implications, right? That stifle your ability to thrive and grow. When we know, as someone said, when we saw police violence, the potential of that life is snuffed out, or our safety comes into question, right? What does that mean for the sociocultural fabric of the United States? So what I want to ask you is, based on what you've learned and thinking about sort of the social cultural context, the norms, the values and customs in which the US operates, what are some other norms, values, and customs that contribute to this structural violence, that contribute to the root? If you've seen all that, I want you to name it. What is the social cultural context? What are some norms, values, and customs that are feeding into this root? And Kendra, I'm going to ask for your assistance again in amplifying the voices of the participants.
Of course.
Again, just a few minutes, folks.
So far, we have cultural appropriation and microaggression, racism and denial of it, and a broken family structure. Education, media representation, community, the American value of independence and people believing that you should be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, income inequality and acceptance of it, all lives matter, raping and robbing communities of resources, mass incarceration, loss of a belief system, lack of access to resources, failed parenting interventions, emotional support, privatized healthcare, domestic relationships, lack of cultural humility, loss of language.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's a couple more.
Oh, go ahead.
The belief that slavery has not had a lasting impact. It doesn't matter until the color changes. Art and victim blaming.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So thank you. So you said a lot there, and I appreciate you sharing. The take-home message that I'd like for us and our effort to have a shared framework by which we begin to unpack how we might best live in service to survivors of homicide victims, particularly those in the African American community, is for a moment focusing on those causes. Inequitable structures that are inherently structurally violent, if they're at the root, then the outcome is often trauma. And what trauma looks like are many things that you all have described. It's individual, collective trauma, community trauma, right? The loss of the idea that I value, the loss of life, the loss of my voice, right? And so I really appreciate those of you who began to talk about the idea of understanding that from a systemic issue in terms of racism as trauma, but also understanding that it's something that has permeated the fabric of our society and how it insidiously has its tentacles in everything else. I know that's kind of heavy, I know it's a lot, but as we progress through this webinar, I think that you'll get where I'm going and understand the importance of cementing us, rooting us in that collective understanding. Because without it, we can't, without calling a thing, we can't move forward. And so I've laid some heavy stuff on you. Woosah people. I want us to take a 10-minute break, let that ruminate, resonate, and we're gonna come back in 10 minutes. So it's exactly, I think, well, it's 10:59, so let's say 11 o'clock. Let's come back promptly at 11:10, and we will take yet a deeper dive into homicide, violence, and victimization. And I'll be able to show you, again, that thread of foundation that we've laid at the root and how that is definitely permeating throughout the tree. Thank you so much for your participation. I'll see you in 10 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. It is always a good sign when you have the same people that left coming back for more. I hope that you're still engaged and enthusiastic about rejoining us as we take a deeper dive into better understanding homicide, violence, and victimization. Next slide. So, homicide, violence, and victimization. Next slide. The definition of homicide is the deliberate and unlawful killing of one person by another. I don't necessarily think, and I have some, you may too, have some modifications about the one person. Because when we think about sort of the collective annihilation of a people, or when we think about mass violence, right? Or the chronic way in which homicide violence impacts Black and Brown communities, it's a little bit more than one person, but I digress. For the moment, let's just again root ourselves in the understanding of this definition. Next slide. And so when we think about homicide violence, and in particular, when we think about some of the frequent patterns of homicide violence in the United States, areas that experience the highest rates of homicide violence are predominantly urban. The predominant weapon of choice used in homicides are firearms or guns. And African Americans are 10 times more likely than white Americans to die as a result of gun violence. Let me say that again. African Americans are 10 times more likely than white Americans to die as a result of gun violence. Black men between the ages of 15 to 44 experience homicide victimization more so than any other racial group in the United States. And research on homicide, violence, and victimization, for the most part, the majority of research focuses both on the victim, the person that was murdered, and the perpetrator. Very rarely, within the realm of research, which informs policy, which informs practice. Again, always think about the root, the trunk, the branches that bear fruit. Very rarely are we uplifting and amplifying the voices of survivors of homicide victims. Many of you know of programs in Philly that specifically focus on surviving moms, surviving family members and friends of homicide violence. I've worked with many of those organizations in Baltimore and Connecticut and Boston. However, rarely is this amplified in a intense research way, right? To begin to inform policy and practice. There is also something to that when we think about the structure that allows us to even begin to amplify and investigate the voices of those impacted. Next slide. When we think about global homicide rates, the United States, so looking at homicide violence globally, the United States ranks 6th relevant to the frequency, the rate, if you will, at which homicide occurs. Next slide. What we think about, or take an even deeper dive into understanding homicide victims, next slide, taking a glance at the number of homicides over a 10-year period. Oops, something just happened to my slides. Hold on. That was weird. Un momento. Sorry guys, that was so bizarre. It literally just disappeared. Don't you love technology? You just are in the zone and then all of a sudden it just, Tanya. All right.
Yeah, we got time.
Thank you, Kendra. So let me just go back. Sorry about that, just completely disappeared. So when we begin to take a glance at homicide in the United States, we can see that over a 10-year period, on average each year, 17,000 murders occur in the US. And what you'll hear many people say is that number is fairly low relevant to other forms of violence and victimization. Next slide. But compared to whites and Latinos, when we look at homicide victims by race, Black people make up 13.3% of the population and yet account for close to half of the country's homicide victims. Let me say that again. Compared to whites and Latinos, Black people make up 13.3% of the population and yet account for close to half of the country's homicide victims. Next slide. When we take a specific look at homicide violence in Philadelphia, next slide, here we see a similar pattern of homicide victimization for residents in Philadelphia. We see that in 2007, we had roughly 300 or so, almost close to 400 individuals that were murdered. And then it took a drop in 2008, 2009. We saw an uptick again between 2010 and 2012, a significant dip in the 200 range in 2013 and 2014. And now we're beginning to see a steady incline. For example, next slide. As of June 10th, Philadelphia has experienced 178 homicide deaths, which is a 27% increase from the same time last year. And in Philadelphia, African Americans make up 85% of those killed, even though they make up about 41.5% of the Philly's population. So they make up half of the population and yet account for 85% of the homicides. Next slide. This visual depiction really amplifies, again, the pattern of homicide violence and victimization in Philadelphia's Black community. It starts all the way from 1988, and the blue area, as you can see, overwhelmingly and disproportionately shows that Black people are overwhelmingly represented in terms of homicide victimization. And so we kind of see that next in line are whites, and we see sort of Latinos, Asian, and sort of other. But again, that whole entire blue area represents that 85% that has pretty much remained the same for over 2 decades. Again, I'm emphasizing this. We understand the root of the tree, but we understand what continues to happen and feed its branches over and over again, right? So this chart really, again, provides us with a clear depiction of the disproportionate impact of homicide violence for African Americans. And next slide, Megan, I know our next slide says break, but we're gonna keep moving because it's too early for a break. We just came back from one. So the other thing I wanna get into is, now I wanted to transition us from homicide, violence, and victimization. Actually, Megan, what's really weird is I can't see, okay, gotcha. I can see you. Okay, there, I fixed my screen. So I want to move from understanding the disproportionate amount of individuals who are murdered in Black communities and talk about that population. That population I mentioned previously that is often overlooked. under-acknowledged, if you will. And that population is a population of survivors. Family members and friends who are struggling to make sense out of that which is senseless. Struggling to even function, to get through the day-to-day things that they need to get through. I'm reminded of what drew me to this work when I think about survivors of homicide violence in the African American community. I'm reminded of a woman, a survivor, whose name is Edna. Next slide. For a little over 2 decades, as I mentioned, I've been working with and for African American survivors of homicide victims, for the purpose of developing culturally responsive research, policy, and practice that is resolutely designed to best support them in their grief journey. And I think it's important that you understand what drew me to this work. It's a story I've told many times. In fact, I tell it every time I do a presentation relevant to survivors of homicide victims in the African American community. Because it's a story that humbles me, it grounds me, and it reminds me not only of the urgency and importance of doing this work, but it reminds me that this work for me is not just a job, but it's a calling. So, several years ago, life before grad school, many years before entering grad school, I'm not gonna tell you my age, I'm not gonna do that. I was working at the Harvard School of Public Health, Division of Public Health Practice, working side by side with family members and friends who were surviving the homicide of a loved one. And we were working with survivors of homicide victims for the purpose of developing violence prevention and intervention programs in Boston, Massachusetts. And it was during this time that I met Edna. And when I met Edna, Edna had just experienced the murder of her son. A bunch of us who work with Edna left our jobs and went down to the funeral home to pay our respects. And when I entered the funeral home, I extended my hand and I said, "I'm so sorry for your loss." Edna looked at me with disdain and she said, "I didn't lose my son. He was taken from me." In that moment, that exact moment, I thought, if I, as a trained social worker, even with the best of intentions, didn't know how to help her, to comfort her, how equipped were other service providers? I also thought, how would Edna cope with the murder of her son? Several years later, I was presenting in Boston, and I saw Edna walk through the doors. And I, with such excitement, ran up to her and gave her a big hug because I wanted to tell her I never forgot that moment, and that moment transformed my life, where I made a personal and professional commitment to doing this work, where I was able to talk to other survivors, other Ednas, and help amplify their voices for the purpose of developing interventions, a conceptual model, and a tool of measurement. I was so excited to tell her that I hadn't forgotten. Edna remembered me. And she held onto me tightly and she said, Tanya, I am so glad. I'm so glad you're doing this work. Because I just buried my second son. And I'm not the only one, and the community needs you. You see, for me, ladies and gentlemen, this is not just professional or a job I was hired to do, but it's personal. What you see on your TV screens and your Twitter feed and your Facebook videos are individuals just like Edna and just like me who have experienced over and over again the systemic, the continued and chronic annihilation of us. That was an important conversation that I had with Edna, and it has changed my life. And I will share with you the work that has ensued then that I hope will also help you as you attempt to support survivors of homicide victims. Yeah, thank you, Edna. Next slide. So when we think about Edna, Redman and Doka suggest that on average, each homicide victim has at least 7 to 10 family members and friends who must learn how to cope with the homicide of a loved one, on average. So I want us to take a beat here. We have a homicide victim, and we have, on average, 7 to 10 family members that are struggling to make sense out of that which is senseless. And so when you begin to understand the number of homicide victims and the number of people that are impacted, you begin to understand the ripple effect of trauma that permeates and saturates Black communities. Next slide. Survivors of homicide victims, when we break down this by race, on average, again, each homicide, again, has 7 to 10 family members, and 75% of the survivor population is Black. But what's also important to note that, as I've begun to describe with this data, when you think about the numbers alone don't convey the reality. When you think about who the majority of homicide victims are, young Black men living in urban areas, when you realize that although African Americans make up only 13% of the US population, and yet they account for more than half of homicide victims, and when you understand that on average, African Americans experience the homicide of a loved one at least 2 times in their lifetime. When research suggests that each homicide victim has at least 7 to 10 family members faced with the challenge of learning how to cope with the murder of their loved one, and when we consider African American family members, African American families whose members often include fictive kin, I don't know about y'all, but I have auntie so-and-so who's not related by blood. I've got cousins, I've got a sister who are not necessarily related by blood, but I dare you to tell me that they're not family, right? That's how we operate within the African-American community. And when we consider that fact, that many of those individuals who aren't necessarily related by blood are raising or caregiving for our youth or elderly, and we understand that, we begin to understand that Black survivors of homicide victims, the numbers are more than likely far greater than what research suggests. Next slide. And yet, despite our understanding of the overrepresentation of African-American survivors of homicide victims and the increase in homicide violence, research is limited. So for me, as I say, I was called to this work in order to build a program of research for African-American survivors of homicide victims. And it began by doing work for and with them, by listening to the voices. By listening to the voices, I was able to develop a conceptual framework that, again, let's reach back a couple slides before, speaks to the complexity of the root of trauma, right? That speaks to the root of structural violence that is traumatic, but also amplifies the African-American experience for homicide survivors. Next slide, let's start. So Alexander and Ho talk about this whole notion of cultural trauma, if you will. And they use cultural trauma to describe the experiences of being oppressed, marginalized, and disenfranchised based upon one's racial and/or ethnic status. With that understanding, again, language and our foundation and our framework are so important. With that understanding, when I interviewed survivors of homicide victims, I was able to sort of extract what they were talking about relevant to cultural trauma. And so the following themes identified by African-American survivors of homicide victims fall under that domain. Next slide. Cultural trauma and ancestral survivorship. This is Margaret, a surviving grandparent, African-American grandparent that I interviewed. I just have confidence in African-Americans' ability to be a people and understand from whence we came and understand how much baggage we have been able to destroy or clean up or whatever it is that we have had to deal with that I don't think we were born to bear. I believe the ability of my people to overcome so much, so many things, and still have not truly, in my opinion, arrived at first-class recognition by many, many people. We are still, I think, some of the greatest achievers there are. And so what Margaret was really saying is that there's an understanding, because I understand the root and I understand the strange fruit that is born from that tree, that because my ancestors have been able to survive that, surely whatever comes my way, I will be able to survive that. Many of you, when I asked you to look at pictures, mentioned that resiliency, still patient, still maintaining. These are messages that we were taught by ancestors. Next slide. Under the same domain of cultural trauma, we have anticipated hardship. I'm trying to make sure, this is Elaine, a surviving aunt, I'm trying to make sure that you understand that one of the reasons for me, and I dare say the majority of African Americans and people of color, the reason we keep things to ourselves is life is supposed to have a little bit of pain. You know, no sunshine without the rain. We grew up with those kind of anecdotes that make us hold things in. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to keep your close eye on Elaine. Keep your close eye. We'll circle back to her in a second. But under the realm of cultural trauma, you have ancestral survivorship and anticipated hardship. The understanding that because of structural racism, because of structural inequality that is structurally violent, when I wake up in the morning as a Black person, I have already experienced these traumas. It is important to understand that because you are entering into spaces, you are encountering individuals that before they even experience a homicide have experienced trauma. Next slide. And so with that understanding, then a homicide occurs. And everything changes. Everything changes. One of the survivors that I interviewed said, Tanya, I felt like I entered into a strange land where I didn't speak the language. I couldn't quite utter or explain to family members about what I was experiencing, right? Again, reiterating to me the importance of amplifying the voices, of serving as that translator, if you will, to better understand how we can serve them. Next slide. So again, we have cultural trauma, then a homicide occurs. And what survivors were telling me is that they were entering into a cultural realm, if you will. They were entering into a culture that is altogether unique to their experiences. I deem this, or I call this the domain, the culture of homicide. Next slide. The culture of homicide, we have shame and stigma. Malik, a surviving cousin, says, I try to cope now by not being ashamed to talk about it, because I was ashamed to talk about it, especially being African-American, and the stereotypes of African-Americans, that we are just prone to this. And you know, like every time I tell people this, not every time, I'm exaggerating now a bit here, but someone says, you know, oh, is it drug related? Like this is the first thing that pops out of their mouth. So here, Malik is talking about the whole idea of when a homicide happened, when his cousin was murdered, that there was a hesitancy and talking openly about what happened because there was fear of that experience further stigmatizing the family, his cousin, who in reality it was a drive-by shooting. Wasn't involved in any gang activity or anything of that kind, but that is the first place that we often go. Was it drug related? Was it gang related? What feeds that perspective? What is at the root of the tree that feeds those branches, that allows us to have that perspective? And then how does that perspective of toxicity bear strange fruit? Next slide. Blame. I questioned whether or not there was something I could have done to keep him out of that environment. And therefore, perhaps this never would have occurred. So I guess I'm saying, in some sense, I'm always questioning whether or not I'm partially or a bit somehow responsible for his tragic death. This is Elaine, a surviving aunt, who shared with me that her nephew would spend summers with her. Every summer he would come up to visit. And the one summer he didn't come to visit was the summer he was shot and killed. And so Elaine blames herself from her inability to protect her loved one from harm. I hear this over and over and over again. I shouldn't have allowed him to go to the corner store. I shouldn't have allowed him to go to the after-school program. Something in my gut told me I shouldn't have allowed them to go to the after-school party, right? And so there's this understanding of I'm blaming myself for my ability to protect that person from harm. Next slide. We have, under the culture of homicide, lack of justice. Malik, again, I remember my brother was like, we all know who did it. And the problem is the police aren't doing anything about it. My brother was like, I know who it is. You know, we all know who it is. Because my cousin was apparently not the right target. It is unsolved, and we just feel like they don't care, they meaning the police. I heard over and over again from survivors that if there was a delay by law enforcement to respond to the crime scene, if when they call or they have to repeatedly call and they don't get responses if the murder's unsolved, these are invaluable nuggets of wisdom that really can help us shape the delivery of survivor services, can shape and reform how police engage with survivors of homicide victims, right? And so again, these are things that to consider, that there's a sense, a universal sense, because Malik's not the only one, that there's a lack of justice in terms of the police response, but also surveillance. I mean, when we talked about police brutality, and so that feeds the narrative and the experience of Black survivors of homicide victims. So again, we have the cultural trauma, and we have the culture of homicide. And through their stories, I was very clear on what those definitions were. But there was something else happening. Remember, when I talked to Edna, I wondered, how would she cope? How would others cope? If individuals experience the homicide of a loved one at least 2.0 times, African-American individuals experience the homicide of a loved one at least 2.5 times in their lifetime, how do they get up? How do they function, right? And so cultural trauma and the culture of homicide helped to explain some of this, but there was something else going on here. Next slide. There was an interaction between the two, if you will, that was taking place. Cultural trauma and culture of homicide. There was an interaction taking place between the two that helped to explain this. The work of Lazarus and Folkman, who talk about stress and coping, they talk about it in such a way that a stressor such as homicide occurs, for example. And Lazarus and Folkman talk about stress and coping in the sense that stressor happens. And you appraise that stressor to say, am I gonna use emotion-focused coping strategies? Am I gonna cry to get it all out, to be able to face another day? Or am I gonna use problem-solving coping strategies? Am I gonna figure out how to pay for the funeral? Am I going to, figure out how I'm going to have so-and-so fly in for the repass, right? I'm gonna do those tangible things to help me cope with it. Right? So Lazarus and Folkman talk about that, but the appraisal piece was very key. A stressor such as homicide occurs, and survivors appraise that stressor, right? To determine what coping strategies will be utilized to manage that stressor, the impact of the homicide. And yet for African-American survivors of homicide victims, it didn't appear that it was simply an appraisal, if you will, that we were just appraising to see if we could use emotion-focused or problem-focused coping. That what was going on was something altogether different. Next slide. And that difference was what a very good colleague of mine, who's a sociologist, Sean McGuffey, deemed as racial appraisal. Next slide. He discusses the fact that racial appraisal, for people of color, disenfranchised populations, if you will, racial appraisal consists of both culture and structure. Culture, norms, values, and customs. Structure in terms of systems, the roots. Understanding culture, that it's, again, a shared set of attitudes and beliefs about the way things should be done. That's crucial to how people perceive what we think, what we believe to be true, and cope with trauma. Structure shapes those perceptions in that it dictates the distribution of resources that one might use to cope with the homicide of a loved one. But here's the rub. Race is a component of our social structure. that allocates material goods and services, social and psychological resources unevenly throughout the United States for people of color. With this understanding, marginalized populations like African Americans appraise stressful encounters and assess coping resources based upon this paradigm. I understand that because I'm Black, I experience racism, which is inherently traumatic. I'm now going to look at a service, appraise that service. Are you going to blame me? Are you going to stigmatize me further because of what has occurred? Will I get quality services? Will I have equal access to those services? Those are the kinds of things in which African American survivors of homicide victims are appraising the impact of the homicide under. Next slide. So with this understanding, again, cultural trauma and culture of homicide, and understanding that that interaction can be best explained by racial appraisal. Cultural trauma happens just by being Black. You experience the homicide of a loved one. There is something else. The appraisal dictates what coping strategies African American survivors of homicide victims rely upon. Next slide. So first coping strategy, spiritual coping. My grandmother used to say, if you have a problem, take it to God. She didn't say, take it to the therapist. This is Elaine, folks. Keep your eye on Elaine. Meaning making. I believe in God, but to a certain extent, because I don't think God takes an innocent baby or a person that good that wants to help the world. So I keep telling myself he probably needs another angel now. Trying to make sense out of that which is senseless by rooting oneself in their spiritual beliefs and upbringing. This is Langston, a surviving cousin who was 18 at the time when I interviewed, right? So we have spiritual coping, right? I'm not going to take it to the therapist. I'm going to talk to God. And then we also have being able to explain how the homicide happened. Next slide. Maintaining a connection to the deceased as a coping strategy. I try to cope with it by maintaining a personal connection with him, meaning like having conversations with him sometimes when things get difficult, or remembering that I don't want anybody else to have to deal with the kind of thing that I did. So almost talking to him or praying to him to get through not only the grief that I feel regarding his loss, but also to get through and do the work that I needed to do. This is actually Trinity, who's a social worker, whose cousin was murdered. And she was thinking and reflecting about how do I continue to maintain that connection in order to protect someone else from having to go through what she went through. Next slide. Collective coping and caring. I really focused on what my family was going through rather than what I was going through. I was really like, what do you need? How do we get this together? So in many ways, that was my coping mechanism by not dealing with it in many respects. So I focused my energies on helping other people. Now, it is well documented in African American family therapeutic literature that African Americans rely heavily on collective coping to cope with any type of stressor. What I want to uplift here is the difference. Many of the survivors that I have interviewed discuss the fact that out of all their family members, when a homicide happens, there are typically one or two individuals who are caring for everyone else. They are pulling together resources to make sure they can pay for the funeral, to pay for the repast, to fly Auntie so-and-so from another state so she can attend the funeral. They're normally checking on the immediate surviving family member after everyone has left. But here's the thing. If that is the way in which many survivors are dealing with this, where are they going to get help? They're coping by collectively caring for one person or people, but where are they going to get help? Next slide, concealment. This is Elaine. I think I tend to internalize and find a small part of my heart or a small part of my mind, an actual small closet in my heart or small closet in my mind to shut off those things that bother me. I don't know if you remember the movie The Godfather. There's a line in The Godfather where Michael says to his younger brother, you never speak against family, you never disagree with the family, you never go outside the family. And I think that is kind of my mantra. I'm just not of the belief that you go outside the home to garner assistance with family or personal problems. Now, we can tackle this many ways. We can understand that the reason why Elaine is concealing and not sharing with anyone that she is a survivor of homicide victims is because, you know, we need only look at historical and even current complexities of our healthcare system. Tuskegee experiment, where individuals have been tested, right? So there's that sort of historical cultural trauma that has occurred. If we think about the root causes and consequences in every space and place that people go, there's structural inequity. What is the likelihood that I'm going to believe in something that's designed to help me if it hasn't historically, right? So that's what's happening. The other thing that's interested here in terms of concealment is that Elaine has diabetes, high blood pressure, and smokes about a pack and a half of cigarettes a day. So while we're concealing our emotions, there's a tremendous amount of self-medication going on. And I don't think it's any coincidence. And there are a few studies relevant to examining the correlation between survivors of homicide victimization and medical health outcomes. But it's no coincidence that when I talk to survivors, I've had several say, you know, I feel pain where my son was shot. I have headaches, or right after my son was shot, I had a stroke. The carrying and the weight of all of those traumas and concealing them and not having a safe space to go disproportionately impacts the health outcomes. So we're not only dealing with compromised mental health, we're also dealing with compromised physical health and, dare I say, spiritual well-being here. So that's Elaine. Next slide. So when we think about, again, cultural trauma, and we think about all of the cultural trauma and the culture of homicide and the interaction that's going on in terms of racial appraisal and how that basically informs the coping strategies that I've mentioned. Next slide. We have a model of coping, if you will, a model of coping that really helps to uplift the social cultural context in which African-American survivors of homicide victims experience the homicide of a loved one. So if you'll take a look at the model, on the left-hand side is almost your eye, your worldview, if you will. So again, African-Americans wake up because they're Black, they understand that they will experience cultural trauma. I anticipate that someone's gonna follow me all around the mall. We teach our Black sons when they first get behind the wheel, there's a high likelihood that you're going to be pulled over. When you get pulled over, you put your hands on the wheel. You do not reach for anything. If you can, you videotape. We teach them this, right? Because we anticipate that there's going to be hardship. There's going to be some sort of violent atrocity, right? That happens before a homicide happens. And also we've been taught these messages from our ancestors about how to survive another day, right? So almost many of you even mentioned it when I was showing you the videos that, you know, that these messages that we can be resilient, we can be resilient, but at some point the bow is going to break. At some point you can't keep piling on the trauma and say, it's a resilient community, right? We got to fix the root. So cultural trauma happens, then a homicide happens, right? And then the survivors enter into a culture of homicide that's altogether unique, where shame and blame and stigma and a lack of justice are most paramount. But then there's some intersection that's going on where individuals appraise that homicide to understand, okay, what's gonna protect me and what's going to support me, what's gonna be harmful to me, and in shepherding my ability to cope with the grief and the bereavement that I feel. And they've identified different coping strategies to do that. Spiritual coping and meaning making, maintaining connection to the deceased. This is when you see decals, you see tattoos, you see teddy bears, and candle vigils on every street corner, right? They're maintaining a connection to the deceased, collective coping and caring, and then concealment. And so with this model, again, I guess I've always been like this, huh? It's about laying the foundation, laying the framework from the voices of survivors to be able to serve as a springboard by which we can begin to develop interventions, we can begin to develop tools of measurement, and we can begin to develop, create systemic change as well as trainings so that individuals understand how to respond in a culturally responsive manner. Yet again, woo, like woo, right? Break. So yet again, I recognize I've given you all a lot to digest. I want to take another 10-minute break. And when we come back, I want to hear from you those burning questions that you have. I want to walk through, based upon the foundation that we've laid today, some of the implications for research, policy, and practice. So it's 11:55. We'll be back at 12:05. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back. We're at the home stretch, and so I just want to say thank you so much for staying with me, being such great participants, actively engaged in today's webinar. I want to sort of attempt to make sense of all that I've offered here today in terms of, again, understanding at the root of the tree is really structural violence, structural inequities that are structurally violent, that cause a tremendous amount of trauma disproportionately in Black communities. And that when they experience the homicide of a loved one, again, they enter into a culture of homicide where shame and blame and stigma is most paramount. But because of that structural violence, the structural inequities that they understand to be true, that are at the root of the tree, that informs and the appraisal of what's available for them to cope. And so oftentimes, African-American survivors of homicide victims will rely on specific coping strategies that they'd identify that I just walked you through. With that understanding, I think that there are some implications for research and policy and practice. With that firm framework, right? That shared collective language that we've established with one another, I think there's some implications for research, policy, and practice that can be implemented here. Next slide. Next slide. So implications for research. When we think about, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, but we only have 3 hours, folks. I could go on and on and on. Call me, email me, if you want to chat further. But these are just some things that I have been ruminating with and been able to cement or am in the process of trying to. Particularly with research when it comes to capturing the survivor experience, exploring specifically the experiences of African-American survivors of homicide victims. And I think it's important to start there because well, screw it, I'm gonna be honest with you guys. Can you guys keep a secret, all 49, 50 of you? When I started out doing this work with the passion and commitment to the work and being called to serve, folks were not too supportive. I was told, why don't you focus on victims of gun violence? They're a larger sample to pay attention to, and then you can look at the cost of hospitalization and caregivers care. I mean, just, woo, yeah. And it was an interesting challenge, being a Black woman in the academy, but also all around me, seeing over and over and over again the utter annihilation of Black people, and no one was listening. It's been 2 decades, and that is changing, but I still feel as though we have work to do in terms of capturing the understanding that the African-American survivors of homicide victims experience is not a monolith, right? Particularly as I sit here in my home in Toronto, Canada, we have African Caribbean folks who perhaps were just working on a study, and I'll talk about that later, but perhaps have different experiences that they bring to the table that impact the coping strategies. Immigrant status. Was your home country a country that you left in the middle of a war? So those kinds of things, we still need to, again, root our programming and practice in capturing those survivor experiences. And to that end, I think it's important to develop culturally responsive tools, assessment tools, measurement that captures the trauma experiences as well as the post-homicide experiences. How are individuals coping? Without that information, it's really a missed opportunity to know the frequency with which homicide occurs, what individuals are using 3 months when the homicide happens, 1 to 3 months when the homicide happens, what they're using 3 to 6 months, what they're using 6 to 10 months. Preliminary research says that people are relying, particularly on what they relied on in the first 3 months, if they do not have some sort of clinical intervention that happens. Once credibility and trust is established, windows of opportunity begin to open up for individuals accepting and receiving help and having that help amplify them within a cultural context. So we have to be able to develop tools of assessment to be able to capture how are individuals currently impacted by the homicide and how are they coping with it. I also understand doing this work that, I have a social work lens, and that the work is all the more richer when I have colleagues that are coming from epidemiology, public health, law, psychiatry, nursing, and so a lot of the projects I work with have partners that I'm collaborating with within the world of academia, but also within community-based agencies. Some of the most profound work that I've done has been in partnership with a program called Safe Streets in Baltimore. Individuals were boots on the ground. We're developing curriculum together so that there's some sort of synergy around actually what's happening in real time, what they are hearing and seeing in terms of youth in particular, how they are coping with violence can be very different from how somebody between the ages of, 35 and 50 are coping. So collaboration kept the research on point and on par with what was going on in real time, but it also allows for a richness of collective individuals coming together to understand the importance of the work and amplify it. And I think those collaborations really allowed for innovation to take place. I think several of the staff at the crib are on the line right now, and they will tell you, since COVID-19, we've had to be extremely innovative. Kendra shared with you that I am the director and founder of the Center for Research and Innovation for Black Survivors of Homicide Victims. I've been here almost 2 years. We founded and launched the center opening in January, and 2 months later, COVID hit. Got the keys to our space. We were ready to throw a huge block party with community, and we had to reshift and be very innovative of how are we going to still put our finger on the pulse and meet the needs of survivors while being in quarantine. So that's just one example, and we were able to do that through social media and online platforms. So I say that to say that space and place, physical space and place, should not limit us for the things that we can do. In fact, it's opened the doors for innovation. I also think in terms of research dissemination is really important. Often, in the research realm, it's a necessity for survival in the world of academia, but I think it's also important in terms of to ensure that publications or presentations or policy briefs are co-authored by individuals who have shared experiences with homicide, violence, and victimization, but also community agencies that you partner with. Because when there's ownership, right? When there's collaboration, there's coalition building, there's trust and credibility that can be established, and it opens doors even further for being able to amplify the voices of survivors of homicide victims. Excuse me, next slide. When we think about implications for policy, next slide, we have a couple of things. Again, not an exhaustive list, but thinking about, again, capturing the trauma histories. There are so many missed opportunities when I think about Smiley, when I think about a project that I launched with one of my former students at University of Maryland, who worked for the DA's office, but got an understanding that there were so many, again, disproportionate Black men behind bars who had experienced the homicide of a loved one over and over and over again. And so what she was able to sort of unpack and speak about is the victim and perpetrator overlap that we often don't unpack. A way to get there is really to understand the trauma histories. right? Because what you have are individuals that are often locked up because it's unchecked trauma, unchecked grief and loss that has been unacknowledged. And so we created a program for the purpose of being able to capture the trauma histories of incarcerated individuals in the hopes of reducing their sentence. That's just one example, but I also think back to many, many years ago when the intimate partner violence movement, when I was in Connecticut, started to implement training, so that, because they understood that parents were going to physicians right before school to have wellness checks and have that form signed so that their kids could go to school. So they understood that basically to have primary care physicians screen for intimate partner violence was a great way to be able to not only be able to assess what was going on, but even to get them access to services. Why can't we do that same kind of thing? If we know the frequency of homicide, violence, and victimization, there are so many different points at which we can begin to do this. I'm thinking, when we think about innovation, barbershops, nail salons, again, primary care physicians, but points at entry where survivors of homicide victims are. When we talk about inclusive victims' rights, I think, again, there's an opportunity with this understanding, with this shared language, to have and implement policy that is more culturally responsive to the African American experience. Let me give you an example. Time and time again, when we think about the fictive kin, the relationship, the aunties and the cousins and the brothers that aren't necessarily related by blood, but someone is caring for them, right? That may not necessarily be related by blood. Why is it that victim services may only allow individuals who are related by blood access to support to bury the person? Access, as Kendra shared with me, to clean up their remains. I think that we have a responsibility to shape policy to expand and fully embrace who Black people are, who Black survivors of homicide victims are. So that's just one of several suggestions. Also the importance of anti-Black racism in policy. If we understand that the root of the tree, there's blood, injustice at the root of the tree, we have a responsibility to then create systemic change through our educational systems, through our voting systems, that centers around anti-Black racism. And I think that starts with language. It starts with having a shared collective framework that allows us the language by which we begin to amplify the injustices on a consistent basis. Then we can begin to create systemic change in terms of policy. And so, we're seeing some of that happen through this iteration of the evolution and iteration of this civil rights movement, in terms of hiring practices, so forth and so on. And so, but I think that we need to keep pressing in this area, for sure. Next slide. When we think about implications for practice, next slide. I think about the fact that we have to be reminded, particularly when we think about the fact that the African American community on average experiences the homicide of a loved one at least 2.5 times in their lifetime, that grief is not only complicated. When we think about shame, blame, and stigma, we know that grief as a result of homicide violence is often disenfranchised, right? I don't feel as though I have the right to grieve freely, or I can't because I'm fearing that there may be stigmatization if I tell you that I'm surviving the homicide of a loved one. I'm ashamed, right? So there's disenfranchised. It's complicated in the sense that it is often rooted, and again, in these two sort of structures, if you will, cultural trauma and culture of homicide. It's often complicated when it is amplified in the media over and over again. And it's complicated when it's not. When the victim appears on Section D of our newspapers and no one knows their name. And so these sort of things that impact and shape the way in which we grieve and bereave is important to understand. And it's important to understand that because it happens so frequently, that there are no stages. Well, there aren't any stages to begin with in terms of grief. You don't go through step 1, step 2, step 3. I think so that's clear. But that it's this constant ebb and flow, because again, to the second point, when we're talking about trauma histories, there is no post for Black survivors of homicide victims. Whether you are, and Kendra and I were actually talking about this yesterday, we often have in the literature this whole notion of direct and indirect victimization, right? And how we define it is this way. We say that the direct victim is the person who actually is the homicide victim, the murdered victim, and that the indirect victim is that survivor. I think there's another level to this, right? In terms of the fact that if we begin to think about how we're more connected than disparate, in COVID-19, we can't necessarily go out and have lunch or go collaborate with other folks. But what we're seeing piped in through Facebook, piped in through Instagram, is something that connects us in such a way that even if you aren't a direct survivor of homicide victimization, so I'm using those words a little bit differently, you are indirectly getting that. I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that I shared with you that I've been doing this work for over 2 decades. I've seen the video of Trayvon Martin. I've seen the video of Eric Garner. I've seen the video of Tamara Rice. I've seen the video of Sandra Bland. They're watching the murder of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds took me out. Everyone's life, all those lives that I just mentioned, all those Black bodies, the ones I mentioned and the ones that were not, they matter. All those Black lives matter. But there was something about the video. And there was something different about watching the video for me. But I think there was something different about watching that video for the world. See, what we know to be true as Black people is there are several George Floyds and Breonna Taylors that have existed, and Reemies that have existed in our life. But the world has not been woke and watching. And I think that that video made visible what has been invisible to other folks throughout the globe. And it was a painfully powerful moment. I digress. But I think that to that end, when we think about trauma histories, we've got to figure out a way to capture them. But I think we have to understand that we are a global community of survivors. It is no longer an individual family-oriented neighborhood community that, particularly when it comes to Black people throughout the global community, we are a global community of Black survivors. And that is something that I think we, again, have to innovatively be able to capture to best serve. To that end, I think program and interventions must include a social cultural context. If we are not calling a thing, if we're not talking about the root, if we're not talking about structural violence and the trauma that is experienced before you even get to homicide, we are doing a disservice. There is an intersectionality that occurs between the two that changes everything. And so with that foundation and that framework, we can begin to build programming and interventions that speak to that. I go back to Safe Streets. Some of the things that we developed, we were able to develop a curriculum, support our survivors of violence curriculum, where we began to use the language of survivors in each module. You know, some of the young men that helped to develop that were survivors themselves. That's the kind of programming innovation we need to have as well on the grassroots level. Culturally responsive practice, I shared with you the model of coping, and I think that sort of having some sort of visual model and training individuals within that, the MCAASHV model that I offered, will help individuals understand, again, the intersections, the different traumas that are going on, understand how individuals cope, so that they can understand the behaviors that come with the coping strategies as well. And so those are some of the ideas in terms of practice that I'm thinking about. Next slide. So again, not an exhaustive list, but some of those things I was able to sort of uplift into the development of the Center for Research and Innovation for Black Survivors of Homicide Victims, AKA the CRIB. And so the CRIB, next slide, is a multidisciplinary social work research center focused on using community-based methods and principles to advance research, policy, and practice for and with Black survivors of homicide victims. So we endeavor to lead this enterprise through the development of culturally responsive interventions, best practices, and training for service providers and community-based agencies. And we do this through really thinking critically about our mission to reduce service inequities, our vision that we are a global community. We may be, actually we can't even say that. We're not even physically housed anywhere. We're on the internet, meeting the needs of, or trying to establish a foundation that meets the needs of Black survivors of homicide victims throughout our global community. Currently, again, we have projects that are taking flight in Toronto. We have current projects in Baltimore, Maryland. But the idea is to begin to build upon that framework, to develop interventions with community, with survivors, at spaces and places where they exist. For example, right now we're having a conversation with some folks in Johannesburg, South Africa. We're having some conversations with people in Kingston, Jamaica, to be able, again, to amplify the experiences wherever we are disproportionately represented in terms of survivors of homicide victims. Next slide. Some of our projects, when I talked about developing assessments and tools, from that theoretical framework, from that sort of conceptual framework that came and evolved from the voices of Black survivors of homicide victims, I was able to develop an inventory of coping for African-American survivors of homicide victims in an effort to help clinicians better be able to understand cultural trauma, right? And understand the culture of homicide and how that impacts what sort of coping strategies folks are using to better be able to intervene. We have a project called Supporting Male Survivors of Violence in Baltimore, Maryland. We are the lead evaluators for that project, and it's designed to identify, this is where I met Smiley, designed to identify needs and address gaps in services to support community-based trauma-informed services for young men of color between the ages of 14 to 24 and their families. And really what it is it's a gathering of different agencies that already exist in Baltimore, but talking to them about cultural trauma, talking to them about what that looks like in order to better serve, and connecting survivors to different resources that they need, which are real. Survivors in this particular project talked about, again, when we go back to that slide, I need a job. I don't know how to feed my kids. Real basic needs that were going unmet that are traumatic. The root, feeding the root properly. So you have Survivors of Homicide Victims and Mental Health Project in collaboration with the Canadian Mental Health Association here in Toronto. This project is just taking off, but it's a project that's designed to advance understanding of existing approaches to working with survivors of homicide victims from Indigenous and Black populations in order to help service providers understand how do they engage with racialized individuals that experience cultural trauma in a culturally responsive manner. How do they engage in order to uplift their cultural practices, their point of view, in order to help them manage the grief and bereavement that they experience as a result of experiencing the homicide of a loved one. We also have a project called Invisible Wounds. It is the first project, I'm super excited about this, to focus on the African, Caribbean, and Black community here in Toronto, to again, capture their experiences, because there are probably going to be some differences. Off the bat, immigrant status I mentioned earlier. Are they first generation, second generation? What brought them to the country? Those sort of dynamics may shape the worldview before we even get to homicide. So we're beginning to interview folks to be able to capture their trauma histories with for the purpose, again, of developing a conceptual model that speaks to their experiences and then developing an intervention from there. When I mentioned innovation, I think I mentioned that we got our keys to our space and then COVID-19 hit. And so I brought it to the team. I said, folks, we've got to maintain a presence. The crib has to be present online. How do we do that? And to their credit, they came up with the idea of launching a show called 30 at 8:30. Every Wednesday night, we host a show for 30 minutes at 8:30 to basically be able to, it started out and continues to amplify the voices of systemic injustice and the impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable populations. We have just finished our first season and we're on hiatus, working behind the scenes to bring you really exciting content for season 2. And so please, please, please check our Instagram and stay tuned for when that launches. But these are some of the projects that the crib is resolutely committed to uplifting for the purpose of serving Black survivors of homicide victims. What I'm very clear about is if we are not speaking to the root of the tree, then we cannot know how to pave a pathway forward that helps to ensure that the fruit that we bear is healthy and well and cared for. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is where I stop, and I want to hear from you, all the questions and comments you may have. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure. Kendra?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Sharpe. It was wonderful. So as we look in the chat, Laura just put put some information for you all, and I put some information about the PCCD training hours. If you didn't email me, please do so, and then we'll email you a certificate. If you have any questions, we have about a half an hour. Feel free, we don't have to read your name. I will read off the questions people have. We want to make sure that this is an honest dialogue as best as possible through a webinar. So please feel free to ask whatever you need or whatever you want to, and then we'll talk through it. So the first question is, can you speak to the intersectionality, impact, stigma of self-harm, suicide, and sexual trauma when supporting survivors of homicide?
Kendra, can you say that one more time?
Yep. Can you speak to the intersectionality, impact, stigma of self-harm, suicide, and sexual trauma when supporting survivors of homicide?
Ooh, that's a lot. So I will do my very best.
Very loaded.
I'll do my very best. But I think that, again, I think that there's so many, it's very layered and complex, right? In terms of the fact that I'm just thinking about some of the survivors I've interviewed. And I think there are some connections when we specifically are talking about Black survivors of homicide victims in terms of the stigmatization, right? The idea that I don't even want to tell you that I've experienced the homicide of a loved one because you'll automatically, you, the clinician, you, the medical examiner, you, whomever, will assume that this was a drug-related incident or it was gang-related, right? So there's stigmatization. And so instead, as Elaine indicated, we conceal. But I think as a result, when we conceal, the manifestation of grief can permeate the mind, the body, the spirit in different ways if we are internalizing it. So in Elaine's case, she was smoking cigarettes, eating lots of salt, not necessarily taking care of herself, so forth and so on. But we can also say it's access to food. But I think when we talk about self-harm, right, a lot of that is, pain, unexpressed pain and grief, right? You're expressing it internally, harming oneself versus having the opportunity or thinking that you may not have the opportunity to express it outwardly, right? And similarly to suicide, when we talk about self-harm and self-mutilization, often, crying, or actually, I can't remember who it is. So suicide, in terms of just thinking about, and then this also sense of hopelessness. I'm sorry, all these thoughts are flooding through my head, but the thoughts of hopelessness. And I think there's also correlation between, Sean Joe, thank you. Sean Joe has written about the correlation between suicide and genocide, particularly for Black males who are experiencing the homicide of a loved one. If you understand that or believe that you're not going to see age 18 or 21, what do you have to lose? So there's a correlation again, I think, between the homicide, violence, and suicide. And I think the self-harm again is the stifled grief and trauma as it pertains to Black survivors of homicide victims. I hope that was helpful. But that was a great question. I was like, woo.
She says, thank you.
You're welcome, Lakeisha.
The next question is, from the research conducted so far, what will it look like for service providers to provide trauma-informed services to Black survivors of homicide?
I think what it looks like is, as I said, calling a thing a thing. I mean, I hate to be as blunt, but I think, the past, I don't even know what week we are because we're in the middle of COVID, but, I have never heard anti-Black racism uttered so much in the last 3 weeks than in my entire lifetime. And that's a good thing. But I think it starts there with the use of language first, but also understanding, again, the structural violence, right, that has disproportionately impacted Black communities. So when we talk about being trauma-informed, we need to understand and uplift and understand how cultural trauma works, right? Understand that that is a very real lived experience for Black people. And then couple that with the trauma that we know comes from homicide, violence, and victimization, where we experience traumatic grief, where we experience complicated grief, where we experience disenfranchised grief, where coping strategies, again, because of this cultural trauma, may look different. I think it requires training in those two spheres of influence, if you will, to better be able to serve Black survivors of homicide victims in a trauma-informed manner. So I think that it starts at the root of the tree.
All right, thank you. So we have probably 4 more so far. Have you had any opportunities to explore research centered around children impacted by survivors of homicide? Oftentimes we overlook the children during real time and thereafter. If so, could you speak to what interventions best serve as culturally sensitive? If not, if the research hasn't been done, why?
Great question. So for me, I'm just gonna be candid with you. It is a gaping hole in research, particularly focusing on Black children who are survivors of homicide victims. Straight no chaser. For me, when I first started out doing this work in terms of my dissertation, it was, I was one of the first individuals to, if not the second or third, to focus specifically on Black survivors of homicide victims. And I say that to say that when we as researchers have to go through what's called IRB protocol, they often ask you, are you interviewing someone who's 18 years of age or older? When you have a highly traumatized population, such as a survivor of homicide victims, you know that there's increased vulnerability if the person's under the age of 18, at least from the IRB standpoint. And so when I first started out, I got lots of pushback to include children, and I just went for the adults, but the intention is definitely, now that I'm on the other side of things, the intention definitely is, particularly in projects moving forward, to amplify the children's voices. SOS, for example, is one of those projects that was basically focused on, I think our age range was 12 to 21, and we were going to put them in different groups to be able to talk about, again, their experiences as survivors of homicide victims intervention. So that was one of the interventions. It was a 12-week module. There are, in terms of actual practice examples, there is a fantastic program that I work closely with called Roberta's House in Baltimore, Maryland, who's doing some wonderful work with adults and children. And so those are projects that I think are really doing age-appropriate intervention with children who, Black children in particular, who are experiencing the homicide of a loved one. And it starts a lot with art therapy approaches, a lot of play, those kinds of things that allow them to really work out their emotions in different channels. But I think what's fundamental here is to have age-appropriate interventions. Art therapy works very well for a certain age group. And then as we move forward, there was more sort of peer-led focus groups, individuals getting a chance to get outdoors to really begin to, all different kinds of strategies were really, really creative. But I do think we need to do a better job, hands down, of the research in that area. Thank you for the question.
Next question. Can you talk about best practices for therapists, case managers, and victim advocates who are not Black, but primarily work with Black homicide co-victims? Also, do you have any suggested readings?
So in terms of readings, I provided at the end of these slides are about 2 pages of references. I would definitely start there, and then actually take a look at from the articles, take a look at the references that they use within the articles. That is probably going to give you a wide scope and a depth and breadth of who's doing work and what kind of work's being done relevant to Black survivors of homicide victims first. I would definitely take a look there. In terms of individuals who are not Black, who are working with Black survivors of homicide victims, it is possible. It really is possible. One of my former students, Lori, works or used to work at the Family Bereavement Center in Baltimore, Maryland. And I send clients and people her way all the time because she understands the root of the tree and she speaks about the root of the tree. So imagine this. If you've experienced the homicide of a loved one at least 2.5 times in your lifetime, you know there's shame and blame and stigma, right? The culture of homicide. You're entering into the space with this heaviness and this weight. But imagine if a therapist, no matter what they look like in terms of race, size, shape, what have you, simply says, You know, this is heavy. This is, you know, steeped in racism and inequity. Just kind of uplift that in some kind of way into in the conversation before you even have to. It creates credibility. It creates trust, because it means, again, I said, seeing, being, and doing. It translates to that survivor. I see you. I see you. I see all of you. And more importantly, I see the structures in which you sit. And I recognize that despite those structures, that you showed up today, right? That right? So it's those kinds of very candid conversations that happen. And it, you know, that's really how they evolve, with candid conversations. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Can you talk briefly about the systemic failures inherent in the lack of outreach to Black male youth, particularly as it relates to prevention of and intervention following homicide?
Can you say that one more time?
Yep. Can you talk briefly about the systemic failures inherent in the lack of outreach to Black male youth, particularly as it relates to prevention of and intervention following homicide?
Ooh. I think the systemic failure is predicated on institutional racism. I think that is what feeds a lot of it. And so that's what I mean by the damage that the root has done to the trunk, has done to the tree, and has done to the fruit. I think it is a systemic oversight. No, that's not, that means mild. It's a systemic atrocity. If we continue to ignore, the data is there, the visual occurrences are there, and I think that we really have to talk about the many systems that have perpetuated a great deal of the violence that is experienced disproportionately by young Black men. And so I think that has fed into our failure to have consistent prevention programming. You know, I've been in this business long enough to know that we have this system that says, okay, guys, we're going to funnel money through this agency, and we're going to have, 50 programs across the country go after this one pot of money at this one time of year. I think COVID gives us an opportunity to reshift and restart and reflect. The two pandemics that have been going on, the current pandemic of COVID-19, but the existing pandemic of racism. And I think the intersection of those two allows us a moment to really take a step back and say, how are we going to begin to change systems and policies and protocol that allow us to be resolutely focused on intervention? While each community and each neighborhood is different, there are some fundamental things that we can begin to do that are rooted in that understanding, that allow us to better respond proactively, and also when it comes to intervention. And I think that's where we have to begin.
Great. Could you explain further how young Black men with experiences of violence may experience the impacts of the social appraisal aspect of the model?
Thank you for that question, because I think it also correlates or is in concert with the question about peers or youth, right? And not necessarily having a whole lot of information relevant to Black survivors of homicide, young Black survivors of homicide victims. And so I lost my train of thought. Black survivors of homicide victims. Can you repeat the question again? I'm sorry.
Yes, 1 second. Sorry, I'm trying to keep up with the question. Could you explain further how young Black men with experience...
I got it. Oh, so I'm going to tell you anecdotally, right? Because I haven't done the former research study, but I'm telling you anecdotally because I work a lot with youth, right? That model would be different. It wouldn't be completely different, but it would be different. It wouldn't be different in terms of cultural trauma, and it wouldn't be different in terms of the culture of homicide, but it would definitely be different in terms of the coping strategies. The racial appraisal is still going on. I think at least for some of the youth, the young Black men that I work with, there isn't necessarily an understanding of what they're experiencing or what their expression of is grief, right? That they're not making those connections. So that was part of what the SOS program was about, was to help them sort of make those connections to, you experience this and you're doing this, and this is grief. This is what grief looks like, right? This is how you're coping. There's that. But the coping strategies, I guess, for young Black men predominantly were, what did they talk about? They talked about smashing. They were like having sex, self-medication in terms of getting high, getting drunk. They rely heavily on their peers to talk. And one of the things that I'll never forget, one of my friends, good friends from Sage Street JT said, I literally was writing, I remember this, we were writing out the modules and I was like, so we need to ask about feelings. And he's like, whoa, feelings. Like he was, we don't use that terminology. So I think that there are different ways of expressing grief, but I think the connection was to better understand for young Black men what the correlation was. That if you have been experiencing, if you can list 6 people under the age of 17 that have been murdered in your peer group circle, there's no way that you can't be impacted. It might be that you don't talk, you withdraw. It might, many of the young men that I talked to said they don't feel safe. So what does that look like? So it was really unpacking a lot of that. I'm babbling, but it's a great question, but I hope that that's helpful as well.
That was the last question in the chat. Does anyone have any other questions they'd like to ask? Okay, here's one.
Oh, okay.
When is the best time to have the conversation with a child about the death of a parent by violence?
Oh my gosh, so much of the literature will say so many different things. And so I'm asked this a lot by media, particularly when mass violence occurs. And there's a gamut of responses. Some people will allow the child to go to the funeral. Some people will not allow the child to go to the funeral, so forth and so on. I am a firm believer, and this is just my opinion, because some other article or book will say something different. I'm a firm believer of not keeping the truth from children. And I'm also a firm believer in having age-appropriate conversations. When children, are particularly young, it centers around a conversation, bad things happening to good people. I think that's actually a title of one of the books. It centers around listening and holding the space. You'll see sometimes a little one will say, ask questions about where has that person gone. I've seen people talk about if their spiritual beliefs are, centered around Christianity, that person has gone to heaven, that there are ways to remain connected. Again, maintaining connection to the deceased. We can, talk to that person. We can pray to that person. But oftentimes the little one, okay, and then they'll go back to playing, versus perhaps what often happens with, I think, the older kids is usually, a lot of them will retreat. because they see that their primary caregiver is in so much pain and they don't want to overburden them. So they'll often rely on their peers or they'll self-isolate. I think those are the times where we have to actually bring up the conversation. If you see that change in behavior, if they're withdrawing from school, if they're withdrawing from conversation, I think that's when we have to bring it up. So the little ones, it's more about sort of gauging when they're asking questions and responding. And I think as we get older, it's really about monitoring what's going on and initiating the conversation, right? And that conversation, again, has to be candid. You know, I'm feeling this way. You know, I just want to check in to see how you're feeling, because this is heavy. Like, those kinds of authentic conversations, I think, have to happen, but they have to be age appropriate. So that's my response.
Perfect. I think that's all the questions.
Awesome.
We are done, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to the webinar. I put all of Dr. Sharpe's contact information in the chat. We hope that you've gotten something from this. We hope that this will help continue conversations and continue the work that we do. And always feel free to reach out to whomever. Josue, Laura, thank you so much for sponsoring the webinar, and everyone at AVP. Of course, it's always good to have honest and real trainings and conversations, so we appreciate it.
And as Kendra mentioned, again, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Dr. Sharpe, for an amazing presentation. You will all get the recording of this webinar along with the PowerPoint slides, along with the survey. Please, please, please do take the survey, everyone, when you get it in an email. You'll probably receive it within the next hour or two. So we have to give the webinar to download. So please give us some time and you'll get all that information afterwards. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Sharpe.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much. Take care and be well.